The noon sun bore down mercilessly upon the small frontier town of Dry Creek, painting every weather-beaten board and dusty street in shades of glaring gold. The air shimmered, and a hot wind picked up, stirring grit into the eyes of those who dared to linger outside. Most had retreated to the shade of awnings or the dim interiors of saloons. Yet at the center of the street, where the dust was thickest and the silence heaviest, a woman stood with her arms wrapped around a boy no older than 7. Her dress was plain and threadbare, patched so many times it was more mended than whole. Her bonnet hung askew, the ties frayed. But it was not her poverty alone that drew stares from the gathering crowd. It was her desperation. Her voice, breaking and uneven, cut through the stagnant air like a knife. "Please, please, don't take my child away," she begged, clutching the boy tighter against her chest as though her arms alone could shield him from the fate pressing in. 2 men stood before her, their boots planted firmly in the dirt, their expressions as hard as the desert stones. They were debt collectors, ruthless men in the employ of Ezra Pike, the local lender whose pockets grew fat on the misfortunes of others. One of them, lean and sharp-eyed, held a folded paper in his hand, the ink still fresh. The other, broader and meaner-looking, cracked his knuckles and smirked at the sight of her trembling frame. "Widow Carver," the sharp-eyed one said, his tone clipped and unforgiving. "The note was due last month. Pike's been patient, more patient than you deserve. You had time to pay. Now he'll have his due." The boy whimpered and buried his face in his mother's dress, clutching the faded fabric with tiny fists. The woman bent her head, pressing her lips against his hair, as though by doing so she could comfort him and herself alike. "I have nothing left," she whispered. "The crops failed. The mule died. I begged for work, but no one would hire me. I'll find a way to pay, I swear it. Just not my boy. Don't take him. He's all I have." Her words wavered between pleading and defiance, but her eyes, hollow with sleepless nights and hunger, betrayed her hopelessness. The broad man spat into the dust. "A debt's a debt," he growled. "Pike's done it before. He'll do it again. You don't pay, the boy works it off. He's young, strong enough to haul wood, tend horses. He'll earn his keep." Gasps rippled through the onlookers who had gathered along the boardwalks, though no one moved to intervene. They whispered among themselves, clutching at their shawls and hats, unwilling to challenge the collectors or the power of Pike. The widow fell to her knees, still clutching the boy. Her bonnet slipped from her head and tumbled into the dust, revealing hair streaked with early gray, though she could not have been much past 30. She raised her face, streaked with tears, to the men towering above her. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking with raw anguish. "God help me. I'll work day and night. I'll scrub floors, wash laundry, take in sewing. Just don't take my son. He is my life. My last breath." Her words struck the crowd with the weight of tragedy. Some averted their eyes, ashamed. Others shook their heads, murmuring that pity had no place where debts were concerned. The sheriff, standing at the far end of the street, shifted uncomfortably but made no move to interfere. The law was on Pike's side, and everyone knew it. The boy, sensing the terror in his mother's voice, clung tighter. His small face was pale and drawn, but his eyes blue and wide-flickered with fear and confusion. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Mama, I don't want to go." Her heart broke in that moment. She kissed his forehead fiercely, as if trying to brand her love into him, to give him strength he did not yet understand he would need. The lean collector unfolded the paper with deliberate slowness, holding it out for all to see. "By the authority of Ezra Pike," he announced, "this debt is collected. The boy comes with us." The widow's cry rose up, ragged and primal, a sound of grief so deep it seemed to silence the very wind. She clutched her child, shaking her head violently, refusing to release him even as the broad man stepped forward. "Please," she screamed, her voice breaking into the air, echoing against the buildings. "Please, don't take my child away." The town held its breath, and somewhere at the edge of the crowd, a silent figure shifted, watching with dark, unblinking eyes. The widow's cries hung in the hot air long after her words had fallen silent, as though the very town itself had absorbed them into its boards and timbers. Dust swirled lazily across the street, caught in the shifting breeze. The boy clung to his mother's waist, his small body trembling, while the two collectors loomed above her like vultures circling the dying. And yet, it was not just the men before her that pressed the weight of cruelty upon her. It was the eyes of the town, along the boardwalk, behind warped railings and weathered posts. They stood, the butcher's wife with her apron still stained from the day's slaughter, the saloon girl with painted lips pursed tightly, the schoolmaster clutching his ledger like a shield. They had all come to watch. No one stepped forward. They whispered instead, hiding their words behind fans and hats. Some spoke with pity, others with judgment, but all of them, every last one, kept their hands folded tightly against their sides, unwilling to lift a finger. "Poor thing," muttered Mrs. Rourke, who kept the general store. Her voice was hushed, but not so hushed that others couldn't hear. "Lost her man to fever, crops to drought, now this. Misfortune breeds misfortune. She should have thought better before borrowing from Pike," another said, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. "A man's word is his bond, and a woman's no different. You borrow, you pay." "But it's a child," came a trembling whisper. "Not a bag of flour or a mule. A child." "Pike owns half this town," the saloon girl snapped, eyes darting nervously toward the collectors. "What do you expect anyone to do? Cross him? Better her boy than my kin?" The words stung as they reached the widow's ears, though no one had spoken them to her face. Her tears blurred the outlines of the crowd, but she could feel the weight of their judgment, their indifference. Their silence cut deeper than the harsh voices of the collectors. At the far end of the street, Sheriff Morton leaned against the post outside his office, chewing on a sliver of wood. His badge gleamed faintly in the sun, a small reminder of law and order, though he made no move toward the widow. His shoulders sagged beneath the heat and the years, his eyes heavy with the burden of authority and fear. The sheriff knew Ezra Pike well. Everyone did. Pike's money greased the wheels of Dry Creek. His reach stretched from the saloon to the bank to the very office where Morton sat. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but still he did not step forward. To defy Pike was to risk not only his badge, but his life. A small boy standing near the trough tugged at his mother's skirt. "Mama," he whispered, pointing toward the widow's son, "why don't they help?" His mother hushed him quickly, pulling him back into the shade. "Quiet, child," she murmured. "This isn't our affair." The widow raised her head, scanning the crowd through her tears. She searched the faces, desperate for a flicker of compassion, for a hand to reach toward her. But the eyes that met hers were either cold or quickly averted. Those who pitied her looked away, ashamed to be seen with sympathy. Those who judged her simply stared, as though watching a show at the traveling circus. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. Her words meant not only for the collectors, but for the crowd that stood by. "Have you no hearts?" she cried. "Will none of you speak for me? Will none of you stand for my child?" Silence answered. Only the soft creak of wood beneath shifting feet and the distant clatter of a horse's hooves broke the stillness. The broad collector chuckled at her plea, amused by her futility. "Hear that?" he said to his partner. "She asks for a savior." His grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "But no savior's coming, widow. Not here. Not now." The words cut deeper than a blade. The widow bowed her head, pressing her face into her son's hair. The boy whimpered, sensing her despair. The crowd, restless, began to murmur again. Some shuffled away, unwilling to watch the cruelty unfold. Others lingered, drawn by the spectacle of suffering, the same way men linger over a cockfight or a hanging. And yet there was one who did not murmur, one who did not turn away. At the edge of the gathering, half shrouded in shadow, a tall figure stood motionless. His arms were folded across his chest, his dark hair tied loosely behind him. The townsfolk knew him only as Hafe Apache, who came and went with the seasons, taking odd jobs when they were offered, keeping to himself when they weren't. His face betrayed nothing, his eyes unreadable. But he did not look away. As the widow wept and begged, as the boy clung to her skirts, and as the collectors moved closer with cruel intent, his gaze never wavered. The town might have turned its eyes from the widow, but his eyes, silent, steady, and unblinking, were fixed upon her. The crowd shifted uneasily as the collectors advanced, the broad one cracking his knuckles with relish, the lean one clutching his folded paper like a weapon. The widow's sobs filled the air, echoing off the dry, clapboard buildings. But still no hand rose in her defense. And then, without fanfare, the Apache moved. Had been standing at the edge of the gathering, half in shadow beneath the overhang of the blacksmith's shop. He had been there for some time, unnoticed by most, silent, still as stone, his gaze fixed upon the unfolding cruelty. Many in Dry Creek had grown accustomed to his quiet presence on the margins of their lives, a figure seen tending horses at the livery, or splitting wood for a meal, always working hard but never asking for favor. Some distrusted him outright, muttering that an Apache had no place among decent folk. Others ignored him as one ignores a boulder on the roadside, an unmoving fixture, unworthy of attention unless stumbled upon. But now, as his moccasins pressed forward into the sunlight, the crowd felt his presence as keenly as if the earth itself had shifted beneath their feet. He walked without hurry, each step deliberate. Dust rose around him, catching the light like smoke. His dark hair, tied back with a strip of leather, gleamed beneath the sun, and the strong lines of his face betrayed nothing of his thoughts. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the widow, on the boy clinging desperately to her side, and on the two men who sought to tear them apart. A murmur rippled through the townsfolk. "It's him," whispered a man near the trough. "The Apache," hissed another. "What's he want here?" Suspicion bristled in their voices, sharpened by old prejudices and half-remembered tales. Yet none could deny the quiet strength in his bearing, the certainty with which he entered the street. The collectors paused as approached. The broad man sneered, rolling his shoulders as though preparing for a fight. The lean one narrowed his eyes, wary. Few in town had seen the Apache in more than passing, but his reputation lingered like smoke. Rumors claimed he had been a scout once, fighting beside the army before turning away from both bluecoats and his own people. Others said he had killed men with his bare hands, though none could say for sure. What was certain was that he was no stranger to violence. Cote stopped a few paces from the widow. He neither spoke nor gestured, but simply stood there, his tall frame casting a shadow across the dust. His silence pressed upon the moment, heavier than any threat spoken aloud. The boy peeked up through his tears, eyes wide as he beheld the stranger who had stepped forward. For the first time since the ordeal began, the child's sobs quieted. He did not understand why, but something in the Apache's stillness comforted him. As though the earth itself had risen to shield him, the widow lifted her tear-streaked face, startled to find anyone between her and the men who sought her child. Her lips parted, but no words came. She did not know this man beyond sight, yet in that instant, gratitude and disbelief mingled in her expression. The broad collector barked a laugh, breaking the silence. "What's this?" he jeered. "The savage wants to play hero?" He looked to the crowd, seeking approval for his mockery. "Careful, folks. Don't blink, or he'll scalp us all." A few nervous chuckles rose, but they died quickly beneath Coatee's steady gaze. The lean man's tone was colder. "This ain't your business, Indian," he said, his words cutting like a whip. "Best turn back before it becomes your grave." Still Coatee Hatch did not speak. He simply shifted his weight, his stance relaxed but unyielding, like a hunter who has spotted his prey and will not be moved. His hand brushed the edge of his belt, where a long knife rested in a worn sheath. Though he made no move to draw it, the widow clutched her child tighter, fear and hope warring in her breast. She sensed the danger in the air, the thin line between protection and bloodshed. Around them, the crowd fell silent once more, breathless with anticipation. They had seen many disputes in Dry Creek, but never one quite like this. Never had a man, least of all an Apache, stood between Pike's collectors and their prize. The wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of a hanging sign, the distant cry of a hawk. Time seemed to hold its breath, and still Coatee said nothing. His silence was a wall, impenetrable and immovable. Against it, the bluster of the collectors rang hollow. Against it, the cruelty of the town seemed small. And though no word had yet passed his lips, the message in his eyes was unmistakable. The widow would not stand alone. The dust swirled in uneasy eddies as the three men stood locked in a silent standoff. The collectors with their sneers and menace, the widow clutching her child in desperation, and the Apache who had stepped forward with neither words nor weapon drawn. The broad collector, already itching for a fight, cracked his knuckles again, louder this time, as though to punctuate his intent. "You think you can stare us down, Injun?" he barked, his lips curling back in a cruel grin. "Pike doesn't scare, and neither do we. Step aside, or we'll drag the bread out from behind your shadow." His voice was sharp and mocking, but beneath the bravado there was a tremor, a flicker of unease. The silence of the Apache unsettled him more than curses or threats ever could. Men who boasted were predictable. Men who spoke softly could be bargained with. But men who said nothing, they were dangerous. The lean collector shifted the folded paper in his hand, though his free one drifted toward his belt. His fingers brushed the handle of the knife he carried along, slender blade that glinted faintly in the sunlight. The widow gasped, pulling her boy tighter. Her heart pounded as she looked from one face to another, sensing that words alone would not hold back what was coming. "Please," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking under the weight of terror. "Don't hurt him. Don't hurt my boy." But her pleas seemed to vanish into the hot air. The broad man chuckled low in his throat, taking a step closer. "No one's hurting the boy, lady," he said with a cruel smile. "We're just taking him where he belongs. Best not to fight it." He reached out, calloused hand stretching toward the child. The boy screamed. The widow twisted, shielding him with her body. But her strength was no match for the man's bulk. And then, before the collector's hand could close, Coatee moved out. It was not a sudden lunge, nor a wild gesture. It was subtle, just a step forward, his body interposing itself fully between the widow and the man. His dark eyes locked with the collector's, steady and unflinching. The broad man froze, hand hovering in the air. His grin faltered. "You'd best watch yourself," the lean collector muttered, his voice low and taut. "This ain't your quarrel, Apache. Walk away while you still can." Still Coatee had said nothing, but his silence, once unsettling, now pressed upon the men like a physical weight. His stillness carried more threat than any brandished weapon. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, not grasping it, just there, like a coiled rattlesnake waiting to strike. The broad man's pride burned at the hesitation he felt. His jaw clenched, shame creeping up his neck as he realized the crowd was watching. He could hear the shifting feet, the sharp intake of breath from the onlookers. To back down now would mean humiliation. "You want trouble, Injun?" he growled, reaching instead for his belt. His fingers closed around the handle of his knife, dragging the steel free with a hiss. "Then you just found it." The widow shrieked, stumbling backward with her child, her bonnet falling once more into the dust. Her boy buried his face in her skirts, trembling as the blade gleamed in the harsh sun. The crowd gasped. Some turned away, unwilling to witness blood. Others leaned forward, morbid fascination fixing them in place. The sheriff, still at the far end of the street, cursed under his breath. His hand drifted toward his revolver, but he stopped halfway. His eyes flickered to the collectors, then to the Apache, then to the crowd. His lips pressed into a thin line. He would not interfere. Not yet. The broad man brandished his knife, pointing the blade toward Cotier. "One word, savage," he spat, "and I'll cut you down where you stand." But Cotier remained unmoving, his silence louder than the threat. His gaze was calm, steady, unblinking. It was the look of a man who had stood before blades before, who had known fear and survived it, who knew exactly how far he was willing to go. The lien collector licked his lips nervously. "Don't push him, Deke," he muttered to his partner. "This one's got the look." But Deke, broad-shouldered, prideful, and reckless, was too deep in his anger to retreat. He snarled, taking another step forward, the knife gleaming dangerously close to Kotash's chest. The air was thick with tension, charged like the sky before a lightning strike. Every man, woman, and child in Dry Creek felt it. Something was about to break. The widow pressed her hands over her boy's ears, whispering prayers through her tears. The child wept, clinging to her with all his might, and still. The Apache waited silent, motionless, a shadow of judgment standing between cruelty and innocence. The knife hovered. The crowd held its breath. The line between words and blood thinned to nothing, and in that moment everyone knew violence was no longer a question. It was a promise waiting to be kept. The street was so still you could hear the wind whisper through the cracks in the wooden storefronts. The broad collector's knife gleamed, raised just high enough to catch the sun, his lips pulled back in a sneer. The widow's breath came in ragged gasps as she crouched over her boy, shielding him with her own trembling body, and the Apache stood silent. He had not drawn his blade, nor spoken a single word. Yet his presence filled the space between violence and mercy like a wall no man could easily cross. His dark eyes fixed on the broad man's hand, steady, unblinking, waiting. The crowd leaned forward, their whispers gone now. Even the gamblers, the drunks, and the gossiping wives seemed to know they were witnessing something that would be told. Again and again in Dry Creek, the only sound was the boy's muffled sobs against his mother's skirts. The broad collector shifted his stance, blade twitching. His pride screamed at him to strike, to prove himself before the town's watchful eyes. But his gut, tightened by instinct and fear, told him he was standing before something he did not understand. Last chance. "Savage," he spat, his voice strained, though he tried to mask it with bluster. "Move aside." The lien collector whispered urgently at his partner. "Deke, don't. Can't you see? He's waiting." But Deke, blinded by anger, stepped forward, knife raised. And that was when Coty moved out. It was only a single step. But it was the kind of step that changes the course of a fight, the kind of step that tells every man present who truly holds the power. His moccasin pressed into the dust with quiet certainty. His body shifted forward, smooth, deliberate, no wasted motion. There was no rush, no stumble, only the unhurried grace of a predator, closing distance on its prey. That single step sent a ripple through the crowd. Gasps rose, feet shuffled back, and even the sheriff straightened from his post, eyes narrowing. Deke's knife wavered. Coatee, his eyes never left his. They were dark pools, deep and unreadable, and within them lay something ancient and implacable. Not rage, not even hatred. Something far more dangerous. Conviction. It was not the look of a man who might fight. It was the look of a man who would. Deke's bravado faltered. For the first time, the knife hand trembled. He felt the weight of the silence pressing in on him, the weight of those eyes, the weight of a man who feared nothing, not death, not blood, not him. "You ain't," Deke began, his voice catching in his throat, and in a blur, faster than the eye could follow, Coatee's hand moved. He didn't even draw his knife. His arm swept forward, open-palmed, striking Deke's wrist with a sharp, precise force. The knife flew from the collector's grip, spinning through the air before landing in the dust with a dull thud. The crowd erupted in gasps. Deke staggered back, clutching his wrist, face twisted in shock and pain. His bravado crumbled in an instant, replaced by raw fear. Coatee stepped again, closing the distance, and his shadow fell fully over the man. He did not speak, but his silence thundered louder than any curse. The lean collector took a hurried step backward, hands raised, his folded paper fluttering in the breeze. "Easy now," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Ain't no need for blood." The widow's eyes widened in disbelief. She pulled her boy tighter, tears streaming, her lips trembling as she whispered thanks to a man she barely knew. For the first time since the ordeal began, a faint flicker of hope lit her weary face. Coatee bent slowly, never breaking his gaze from Deke, and scooped the fallen knife from the dust. With one smooth motion, he spun it by the blade and let it fall point down into the earth at Deke's feet. The steel quivered in the ground, humming softly in the silence. It was not a threat. It was a warning. The broad collector, humiliated and shaken, could not meet his eyes. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Pride urged him to snatch the knife and strike again, but fear held his hand. The crowd began to murmur, awe and disbelief in their voices. For the first time in Dry Creek, Ezra Pike's men had been challenged openly, and by the silent Apache no less. Coatee's chest rose and fell steadily, calm as ever. He turned slightly, his body angled protectively toward the widow and child. His stance was clear, unmistakable. If they wanted the boy, they would have to go through him. And in that instant, everyone in Dry Creek, collectors, sheriff, and townsfolk alike knew the truth. The fight, if it came, would not be theirs to win. The knife quivered in the dirt where Coatee had driven it, its point buried deep in the packed street. The crowd murmured in awe and fear, the sharp whisper of voices carrying like wind over dry grass. No one had ever seen a man stand against Pike's collectors, no one. And now here was the Apache, silent as stone, shielding a widow and her boy with nothing but his presence. Deke's chest heaved, his broad frame trembling with rage and humiliation. He had been made a fool, disarmed like a drunken boy before half the town. His pride screamed louder than reason, louder than fear. "You think this is over?" He spat, his voice breaking. "You don't get to shame me, savage." He lunged for the knife. The widow gasped, clutching her son to her chest as the boy buried his face against her, crying out. The townsfolk pressed back against the boardwalk railings, fear rippling through the crowd. But Coatee was already moving. His moccasins barely stirred the dust as he stepped forward. In one fluid motion, his foot came down on the knife's hilt, pinning it in the ground before Deke's hand could close around it. The broad collector froze, glaring up at him, face red and twisted. His hand hovered inches from the blade, but he dared not reach further. The Apache loomed over him, calm, unshaken, his eyes cold and steady. "Don't," whispered the lien collector, his voice tight with panic. He tugged at Deke's shoulder. "You'll get us both killed." But pride blinded Deke. With a roar, he swung his other fist, aiming to smash it into Cote's jaw. The blow never landed. Cote caught the man's wrist in midair, his fingers like iron around flesh. The crowd gasped, the sound sharp and sudden. Deke grunted, straining against the grip, but Cote's hold did not falter. His other hand rose, pressing flat against Deke's chest, and with one powerful shove he sent the man staggering backward into the dust. Deke rolled, coughing, humiliated again. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, half in disbelief, half in fear. The lien collector stepped forward at last, his own knife flashing from its sheath. His hand shook as he brandished it, but desperation lent him courage. "That's enough," he barked, though his voice wavered. "This ain't your fight, Apache. Stand down, or by God." Cote turned his gaze on him. The lean man faltered, words dying in his throat. Those dark eyes bored into him, steady as the mountains, cold as the river in winter. The knife in his hand trembled, but pride once again pushed him forward. He slashed at the Apache in a clumsy, desperate arc. Cote sidestepped with the grace of a wolf. The blade sliced empty air. Before the man could recover, Cote struck one swift motion, the edge of his hand colliding with the collector's forearm. The knife clattered to the ground, spinning across the dust. The lien collector stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain. He stared at Cote with wide eyes, fear breaking through his arrogance. "God help us." He whispered that the widow, crouched low with her son, dared to lift her head. Her eyes widened as she saw the Apache standing tall above the two men, his breathing steady, his body loose but ready. She felt her heart hammer in her chest, but for the first time it was not only fear that beat there. It was something new. Hope. The crowd broke into scattered murmurs, voices overlapping. He disarmed them both. Never seen a man move like that. Pike won't stand for this. The sheriff at the far end of the street pushed himself off the post he'd been leaning against. His jaw worked as he chewed the inside of his cheek. His hand hovered near the grip of his revolver, but still he didn't move closer. He wasn't ready to choose sides, not yet. Deke, spitting dust from his mouth, scrambled to his feet. His pride, battered though it was, still burned hot. He snatched up the knife Cote had disarmed him of earlier. His hand shook, not from weakness but from rage. "I'll gut you," he snarled, voice hoarse, his eyes wild. "You hear me, Apache? I'll gut you in front of them all." He lunged again, knife raised high, and in that instant, Cote's hand slid at last to the knife on his own belt. He drew it in a single fluid motion, the steel flashing like lightning as it caught the sun. His stance shifted low, balanced, coiled for the strike. The crowd erupted in cries. Mothers shielded children's eyes, men ducked behind posts. The saloon girl covered her painted lips with trembling fingers. Steel was about to meet steel. And in Dry Creek. Everyone knew this was no longer a dispute over debt. It was a reckoning. The street had turned into a crucible of heat, dust, and fear. Deke's knife gleamed as he lunged, his roar carrying above the gasps of the crowd. But Cote was faster. With a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed by the earth itself, the Apache sidestepped, his body twisting just enough to let the blade slash through empty air. In the same breath, his arm swept upward. The flat of his knife struck Deke's forearm with such force that the collector's weapon flew from his hand and spun uselessly into the dirt. The blow carried Deke off balance. He stumbled forward, and before he could recover, Cote, his other hand, clamped down on his collar. With a sharp pull and twist, he drove the broad collector down into the dust, chest first. The wind knocked clean from him. The crowd erupted in startled cries. The lien collector scrambled backward, eyes wide, hands raised in surrender. His knife lay forgotten behind him. "No more," he shouted, fear cracking his voice. We're done. But Koth did not press forward. He did not strike again, nor deliver a killing blow, though no one in that street could have stopped him if he had chosen to. Instead, he stood over the fallen man, breathing steady, knife glinting in the sun, and then he lowered it. The blade slid back into its sheath with a finality that stilled the air. Deke groaned in the dirt, clutching his arm. The lien collector crouched low, trembling. The fight was finished, not because they had yielded, but because Koth had ended it. For a long, heavy moment, silence filled Dry Creek. The widow's sobs slowed, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts as she clung to her child. The boy peeked out from the folds of her skirt, his wide eyes fixed on the Apache dot, and then finally the man spoke. His voice was deep and steady, carrying with it the weight of stone and the calm of rivers. Not loud, but loud enough that every ear in that street heard it. No debt takes a child. The words fell like iron, simple, final, undeniable. The crowd stirred, murmuring, their voices hushed as if in church. Some blinked in astonishment, as though they had forgotten he could speak at all. Others looked away, shamed by the truth of it. The widow's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled again, but these were not tears of terror. They were of gratitude, of relief so sharp it nearly broke her. She pulled her son close, whispering thanks under her breath. Koth's eyes softened as they rested on the boy. He reached out, slow and deliberate, and laid a calloused hand gently on the child's shoulder. The boy flinched at first, but when he looked up into the Apache's face, he saw no anger there. Only protection, strength, a promise. The boy's trembling eased. He leaned, just slightly, into that hand. The widow choked back another sob. "God bless you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "God bless you for this." The collectors, beaten and humiliated, scrambled to gather themselves. Deke staggered upright, spitting blood and dust, but when his eyes met Koth's again, he faltered. Rage simmered in his expression, but fear quenched it. He knew better than to strike again. The lean man grabbed his partner's arm, tugging. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. "We'll tell Pike what happened. We'll come back." But even as he said it, his words lacked conviction. They knew they would not return this day. The sheriff, still lingering at the edge of the street, chewed hard on his jaw, then finally stepped forward. He looked at the Apache, at the fallen collectors, at the widow clutching her boy. He said nothing for a long moment, then cleared his throat. "You boys best leave while you can still walk," he said, his tone flat but firm. "This town's seen enough." Deke growled under his breath but obeyed, allowing his partner to drag him away down the street, limping, beaten, defeated. When they were gone, the sheriff tipped his hat toward Koth. "Can't say I condone how you went about it," he muttered, "but I can't say I blame you either." His eyes softened just a fraction as he looked toward the widow and her boy. Then he turned and walked back to his office, leaving the crowd to its murmurs. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, shaken, whispering to one another about what they had seen. Some spoke with awe, others with disapproval, but all agreed on one thing. Dry Creek had changed today. The widow looked up at Koth, her eyes wet, her lips trembling. I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Koth met her gaze with the same quiet strength he had shown all along. His hand still rested gently on the boy's shoulder. "You don't need to," he said simply. And with those words, the widow knew she and her son were no longer alone. The dust of the street still hung in the air when the last of Ezra Pike's men slunk away, their shoulders bent beneath defeat. Dry Creek was hushed, as though the fight had stolen not only its breath but its spirit. The townsfolk drifted apart in clusters, some whispering nervously, others shaking their heads. "What'll Pike do when he hears?" A man muttered. "He'll come down harder than ever," another answered grimly. "Maybe." The butcher's wife said softly, her eyes fixed on the widow and her boy. "But maybe some debts ain't meant to be paid." The crowd thinned, leaving only the widow, her son, and the tall Apache who had changed everything. The sheriff lingered in his doorway, watching them with a look that carried both worry and reluctant respect. But he said nothing more. For now, at least, the law would not interfere. The widow knelt in the dust, arms wrapped around her boy. Her shoulders shook as relief poured out of her in sobs, though this time they were not cries of terror. She pressed her lips to her son's hair, breathing him in as though she feared he might vanish if she let go. Cote stood above them, silent once more, his broad shadow cast over their fragile forms. He had not moved since speaking those words that now rang in every heart that had heard them. "No debt takes a child." The boy lifted his head, cheeks streaked with tears. His small hand reached tentatively upward, brushing against Cote's weathered fingers. "Mister?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. Cote looked down at him. Slowly, carefully, he crouched to meet the boy's gaze. His eyes, dark and steady, softened. The boy's hand, tiny and trembling, slipped into his. The widow gasped, her tears fresh. For weeks she had lived with despair clinging to her like a second skin. Now, as she watched her son cling instead to the hand of the man who had saved him, something new bloomed inside her. Hope. Why? She asked suddenly, her voice breaking. She pressed a hand to her chest, searching his face. "Why would you do this for us? You owe me nothing. And this town?" She glanced around at the retreating backs of those who had stood silent while her world nearly crumbled. "This town would have let them take him." Kotia held her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, in that low, steady voice, he answered, "Because no one else would." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any grand vow could have. It was not charity nor pity. It was justice. The widow bowed her head, pressing her lips to her son's hair once more. Her tears fell silently into the dust. "Then you are God's answer to my prayer," she whispered. The Apache rose to his full height again, his hand lingering protectively on the boy's shoulder. He scanned the street, his gaze narrowing at the empty horizon. Though the danger had passed for now, he knew Pike's wrath would not be far behind. The collectors would return with more men, perhaps even the law on their side, but he also knew this: the widow and her child would not stand alone. When that day came, the sheriff finally stepped out from the shade of his office, his spurs jangling softly against the boards. He tipped his hat to the widow, then gave Kotea a long, searching look. "This town may not thank you," he said gruffly, "but I will. You did what needed doing." Kotea inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. Words were not his gift. The sheriff sighed, glancing at the widow and her boy before turning back toward his office. "Keep him close, Apache. If Pike's smarting, he'll come back meaner. And next time, there'll be more than two." With that warning, he disappeared into the shadows. The widow rose shakily to her feet, her son's hand still gripping Kotea's. She looked up at him, her voice soft but steady now. "Will you? Will you stay? At least until it's safe?" Kote studied her for a moment, then the boy. The child's small fingers clung tightly to his. "Unwilling to let go. Double quotes, yes," he said at last. The single word carried more weight than 1,000 promises. The widow smiled through her tears, her shoulders easing for the first time in months. She pressed her free hand over her heart, whispering, "Then we are not alone." And so it was that in the hot, dust-stained heart of Dry Creek, A new bond was forged between a widow with nothing left, a boy who had nearly been lost, and a silent Apache who had stepped forward when no one else dared. From that day on, whenever the townsfolk whispered of debts of pike, or of the cruelty that shadowed their streets, they also spoke of the moment the Apache stood between despair and innocence. A man who needed no words to tell the world where he stood. And though the threats of tomorrow loomed large, for one fragile afternoon the widow and her child walked home not in fear, but beneath the shelter of a promise stronger than fear itself.